Hello, and welcome to What We've Learned, episode 7. And this week, we're talking about training. As ever, I'm joined by Shane Redding. Hello, Shane.
Hi, Steve.
So, training is something close to both of our hearts, but it's something you have been doing a lot of late. Thoughts? What's been changing, Shane? Why should we talk about training today?
Yes, lots to talk about, not just of late either. I was trying to recall when I first did my very first training gigs, and I reckon it's a bit scary. It's at least 35 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, wow.
So, hold on, you started training when you were 7, Shane. Amazing.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, of course I did. Child prodigy. And of course, loads has changed in that time. And online training, which we're all talking about, has been around, in fact, for a very long time. But I think the reason that I'm really keen to talk about it, and I think you found this too, is since COVID, just how quickly training has changed even more in a virtual world. I mean, it was already changing, but just the pace of change and already some of the style and formats. And I know you've been doing training this week, so I'm really interested to know what you found's changed.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And by the way, fact fans, October the 21st, 2004 was the first time I ever did training, and you happened to have been in the room, Shane, which is probably why I've hung on to your coattails ever since. Yeah, so I ran a course for the IDM this week on a one-day digital strategy course. And what I think's been interesting for me, and I'm sure for others listening in, when they're wrestling with training, and we can expand that out, I think, Shane, with learning, with knowledge, with education, but with the training hat on, taking people through a syllabus that I would have typically delivered in classroom, in person. The way that we worked it on Wednesday, using Zoom, of course, we are the Zoom generation, was 3 90-minute blocks. So starting at 9:30 in the morning UK time. And interestingly, one of my delegates, although normally based in the UK, she's locked down in Texas with her family at the moment. So for her, bless her, it was 4 a.m. a starting point for some training, which is an
Wow.
interesting, yeah, indeed. And an interesting one, of course, what I'm sure we'll come on to in the balance of just because you can train people at the time via the technology we've got, is it the best thing for them to do? The 90 minutes worked well. So I think in simple learnings for us and anyone else involved in training, you can probably deliver more online. You lose less time, which is a positive. But the negative is what you're losing is the ability to have such a depth of discussion. So we did use Zoom, we did use voice, and we used webcam, which I think is really important. And I'm quite a late convert to the value of having a webcam turned on for these things. So that you can keep that discussion going. So 3 times 90-minute blocks seem to work well, but I think that's probably people's capacity within a day, and maybe even that was stretching things, Shane.
I think that's really interesting. Never mind their capacity. What about your capacity, Steve? Because doing physical a whole day face-to-face, any teacher will tell you the adrenaline and the energy you put into a room is significant, and you do feel really tired. And I personally, I'd be really worried about doing a whole day virtually. I think you tend to be sitting rather than standing, whereas normally I might need to change the way I train and actually stand, because I think that would help me. But how did you cope delivering all of that training in one day?
Yeah, it's a good point. So you are sat, of course, at a desk, and there are very practical considerations compared to being face to face. If you want to have that eye contact with the webcam, then you can't wander around too much, even if you've got, like I wear, a headset that you can wander around a little bit. It was mentally exhausting, Shane, I have to say. But then, to be honest, I find, and I'm sure you do as well, a day of training, however delivered, is exhausting more mentally than physically because of the concentration and trying to objectively move things along, to keep things relevant and to keep the discussion as well as churn the PowerPoints. I think you've got an extra dimension to consider here, which is the technology. So, the technology problems face to face are often the projector, but someone else can take care of it. And remembering to click forward rather than back on your remote clicker. Now, of course, you've got to think about the chat box, the annotation. If someone's having a technical problem, is it your responsibility? So it is quite a lot to take on from a multitasking point of view, for sure.
I agree. And I think actually the ones I've done, it's helped if I've had a moderator, because that takes some of the burden off monitoring the tech stuff. And I think we have to remember that not everybody's got great Wi-Fi internet connection and they might be dropping in and out. But I just want to pick up on the point you made about using Zoom and the people for whom that works well. It was a really great article which we'll tag in the LinkedIn conversation, like we often reference more resources there, in National Geographic this week, which is about basically Zoom overload, and it was something picked up by Joel Harrison at B2B Marketing as well. And I think we have to be very cognizant of the fact that we're all getting quite sort of weary.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to be thinking about somebody's working week and I think it's something we'll come on and talk a bit more about later, but we really need to think about the right way to deliver training. And certainly I know the effort you put in and the effort myself and other trainers in marketing to make sure that we use all of the tools for people in order to engage them and to get them to interact and to set exercise is really important.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Shane, and it's just transferring the same kind of approach. You need to use different skills when you're face to face to engage people, whether it's your pace or your tone, physical, movement, language, etc. It's using the technology versions of that. So knowing when to use with the likes of Zoom, the annotate options, which personally I find a great way, probably the most effective way of running something like that without having to prepare polls. You can be much more dynamic with the annotation tools that just allow you to get everybody to edit a page. So you can do quizzes and all sorts of things much more readily. But it is still technology, so it's prone to going wrong. It's just an extra piece to consider. Just because you can use the technology doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do, I guess, is my take so far.
And I think picking up on that point, also, there's a huge assumption, it's almost the elephant in the room at the moment, that's basically, well, everybody got time to do training at the moment, and we know that's certainly not the case. Some people, have absolutely no time to do anything beyond the day job, and more, because they're doing so much more on multitasking. So I think what's really interesting is to think about now, and I think you've been having a chat to Debbie about exactly this.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. It's not just you and I. I'm sure anyone listening in feels that way. But Debbie James is far more learned than myself on this. She's global capability manager at BP. So Debbie has for a number of years been front and center of learning. She looks after 700-800 marketeers within BP and helps them from a learning point of view. So I had a chat with her, and the first question I asked Shane was, look, how have things changed with training in the recent weeks and months? Okay.
I think it's a really interesting question, actually, and it has been pretty variable, I have to say. So I personally have been delivering all of the marketing training virtually for the last couple of years. So I've luckily been in a very good place anyway, because that's what we were already doing. And luckily the organisation has chosen the Zoom platform for all of our virtual learning. So we actually are set up very well to be able to deliver quality virtual training. So that's been quite fortuitous, actually. In terms of what's been happening, I think it's really dependent on the part of the organisation that you're in. Some people are working in operations, they're busier than ever, really incredibly busy, haven't got any time to do training. Other people are less busy. I mean, we're all at home. Those that aren't in sort of operational type roles that have to be either in the refineries or offshore. So we've got a lot of our employees, the vast majority are at home. And I think there's a few things happening. So some training programs are face-to-face. They've obviously had to be cancelled. We've also stopped other things because we're in quite cost-conscious times, I would say, and as I imagine that pretty much everybody is. And we're being very focused on what it is that we are running. So in terms of the marketing offer, which is mine, we have cut some of them. But actually, funnily enough,
when you say cut some, do you mean some of the courses you've just not had the demand for of late?
No, we will actually just be running less. We're in very cost-conscious times, so we are really focused in on delivering the training that is really going to make a difference to where we're going strategically. So it's really sort of honed us in on exactly what we want to be doing, and we know that these are the things that are going to deliver the most value. And I would say that that's happening more broadly. There's some critical face-to-face training that will have to be transitioned. But as I said, and this is where I find it easier to talk, particularly about my personal circumstances, which is being in charge of marketing training. What we've actually done is accelerated the learning offer.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, Debbie, it sounds quite positive. And not that the word positive is used a lot at the moment. That forget the environment and the wider world. This is played almost to your aims, which is to move more people to devour this kind of content, this training in this way. So you're finding that more people have got time and an inclination to focus on this themselves, and it marries to those initiatives you've got. You want to move them to those strategic areas that are important to BP.
Yeah, I think definitely. We've actually accelerated in programs that we're going to be running later in the year in response to demand. And I think I see a couple of things happening. Some people do actually have more time on their hand because activities necessarily have been paused in certain areas, so they are much more willing to be able to dedicate, and I suppose the point here is that we do run quite a bite-sized version of training. So we have 1 hour to 1.5 hour webinars, and then they are supplemented by bite-sized self-paced learning, which we house on learning pathways. So we're not asking for big chunks of people's time. It's quite easy for them to fit it into their days. We have brought a lot of things forward that we were planning already, so we've accelerated those. And I would say that we are regularly seeing, so we've probably got in the region of about 700 marketers. We're regularly seeing it on any one webinar around 100. So really good participation. And anecdotally as well, so we're getting good feedback because the things that we're looking at are strategically where we want to focus. We've taken a conscious decision to update all of our materials. So we're looking at things like behavioral economics, account-based marketing, marketing with empathy, social media in its various aspects, digital, and very much focusing that on what does COVID-19 mean to that. I mean, these subjects lend themselves very nicely, and people are obviously very keen to start thinking about how do we respond to this now? What's the right way to respond? There's lots and lots of initiatives going on within BP in terms of BP Steps Up, and the businesses are taking, BP as a whole is very got a big social conscious, and we've been doing a lot in that area. So we can reference all of that, but then we're starting to think about, where do we go after this? I mean, no one knows what's going to happen, but we have to prepare ourselves for what's coming next, and we're focusing very much in on these sorts of topics, as well as sort of the overall themes that we're teaching as well. So I think there's a lot of interest from that perspective, but just from the other perspective, and this is very much anecdotal, from what talking to different marketers, what I've been told is also, we're in unprecedented times and people are stuck at home, and a lot of us are not used to working at home. And, on top of that, you've got the broader social isolation. So actually having that ability to take an hour, take 90 minutes to come out of that day to day, to actually make those connections, think about something else, connect with colleagues across the world. I think people are really appreciating that. It's something different. It's something, just to distract them in what are pretty challenging times, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, it's a really good point, isn't it? That's the benefit of the technology. As you mentioned, face-to-face cannot happen at the moment. And the geographical spread of your business being global means a lot of these people that perhaps would only have seen each other in a room if they happen to be on the same continent at the same time, can kind of collaborate via this technology and learn with others that are in completely different parts of the business.
Yeah, I think it's driving connections, and that's always been a really big thing as well, about driving connections across different geographies, across different businesses. But now it's just more of that feeling of belonging. Every single webinar that we have, people will join a bit earlier. A lot of people will, and there'll be chats about how are you getting on. It becomes much more social as well, and I think BP as a company is very much around that. It's a very caring company. I think Bernard Looney, our CEO, sets that from the top. He's a very human CEO, cares a lot about the employees. You can really see that shining through. Very a big proponent of mental health, and also just around the community. So I think, we are very much supporting each other through that. And it's very interesting to see learning taking almost that bigger piece. So not only are we building our skills for the future, and I'm looking this very much as sort of 2020 is the year that we'll invest in you. Taglines were sort of thrown around, but we're very much looking to expand where we're going, not just on on formal learning, the bite-sized pieces, the lunch and learns, maybe the best practice sharing. I'm actually at the moment looking at a broader plan for what we can do for the rest of the year, because there is very much interest in saying, the very English expression, if you get lemons, you make lemonade. Well, how can we really take this situation and make the best out of it? How can we utilize this to really get our marketers to invest in themselves, to facilitate that best practice sharing, that community building? And I think there is a big mental health element in this as well, and learning can play a role in that, and just raising people's spirits.
Culture is a really key part of what you've just said. It comes as any organization with the CEO down, but that balance is what you're striking, it sounds, is that you're giving that individual something to keep them occupied, as you said, to keep them distracted perhaps, but it's also helping the business, because you've tailored your courses and you're adapting the courses you run to make sure that they're good for what BP needs to do as they keep the wheels turning of sales and marketing right now.
Exactly. I mean, we have a long-term ambition that's been set out by Bernard in terms of reinventing BP. We aim to be net zero by 2050 at the latest, and as well as low carbon, we've got a big social responsibility, and that obviously then filters down to the whole organisation and where we need to go as an organisation to get there, with big impacts on marketing as one of the functions too. So very much as we are planning offers, we're looking at where we need to go to get there, and our marketing offers are actually tailored to that aim, as you can imagine. But very much now as well, COVID-19, how do we respond to that? How's the overall organisation responding? What's going on out there? How do we want to react? And some really good questions that I know from talking to partners and people like yourself as well, everybody's asking. So which of these trends are just now because of COVID-19, and what is fundamentally going to shift? We're talking about a new normal. What is that new normal going to be? Are we ever going to go back to how it was before? Arguably not. So what is that new normal going to look like? And I think we can really utilize this as an opportunity to move forward in a very positive way. If you look at it from an environment perspective, which is obviously something we're very focused on, you can look at emissions going down. There's been lots of positives out of this, sort of unintended positives. Well, we don't want to lose all of that. So, and I think you can look at that also from a learning perspective. I mean, we were delivering virtually anyway, but we would very much like to keep this momentum going. There have been massive changes. What can we take from that and keep going forward?
So as you said, Shane, fascinating stuff. Debbie does know and has had that experience. Really interesting how, as you say, not everybody's got the time. You've got to be respectful of that. But keep that momentum that she talked about. Keep things going forward, whether those things are digital or perhaps they change back. What did you think?
Oh, great. Absolutely fabulous. And I wrote down 4 takeaways for myself personally to apply. So first one, really challenge yourself, your organization. Why are you doing it? Really important, setting that objective of the training. And I think at the moment, and I love some of the things that Debbie brought up, it can be upskilling, it can be cross-skilling, training staff in completely new areas. And then this sort of softer one, this point about the staff engagement or benefit, but being really clear, is it seen as a benefit to them at the moment? Or if they're juggling young children or other issues in their lives at the moment, they might not see it as a benefit. So giving them the flexibility of choice of when and how to consume it, and maybe even if they want to consume it, I think is really important. So for me, that number one, why are you doing it?
Yeah, I think Shane's such a good point. And Debbie didn't say it on there, but she could have easily said, and I know Debbie from having worked with her over a couple of years, she has 3 young children herself. So she can very much empathize and understand what it's like to strike that balance of being, professional person and a parent and a family member as well. So yeah, really important. Just because, again, as we said, just because you've got the technology and the route to people, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to force them or to move them to have to do these things.
Yeah.
So that's the why then, Shane.
That's the why. And I think on that point, communicating the why as well, explaining to everybody how this training will help the organisation be fit for purpose, it will help the business to survive and thrive, is equally important. Sometimes I see training goes out there without really any context, it being all about the individual rather than about explaining that it's about the organisation trying to change as a whole. And that context is so important.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, what's after why then, Shane?
Time. There's lots of debate, I think, about the right length and format at the moment. And the honest answer is, of course, we don't know. We don't know what's right because we're only just starting to get in the analysis of what's working and not working. And you mentioned right at the beginning, doing your whole day of 4 90-minute sessions. Is that what the delegates want and like? Because it's intensive, they can get all their questions answered, you make it super interactive, or actually, is it about on demand, catch up, quick, sort of the bite-sized learning? And I think, to me, one of the things that, again, if you're not clear on the why you're doing it, the purpose and the objective, it's much harder to work out the right format. Once you've got this clear objective, upskilling, for example, can be quite short and sharp. So different approaches. Do you agree?
I completely agree. Yeah. And I think there's a couple of points there for me. One is we don't yet know, as you say. However, we do know, if you transfer it back to the face-to-face world, that there is fatigue. If you try and put people into an intensive course, so a course that I've tutored over the years that is run day release is also run as an intensive 3-day block. And you look at the data in terms of how people learn, and by about day 2 afternoon, they are struggling. It doesn't matter how good and engaging that speaker is, that tutor. It's very hard for people to take things in. So I think we already know there's a problem. It's just we don't yet have the insight on what that transfers to with digital, but we must recognize it. And then I think, again, in terms of, as you say, it doesn't have to all be move traditional offline learning onto digital, bite-sized. And Debbie made a good point for their learning pathways at BP, where they've got the core delivery of a live or recorded webinar, but then you can go and graze on other aspects. And I think, Shane, for that's a really good way of recognizing that people will be at different levels. So you can get them to consume that content before or after the main center point of training that helps them get up to speed, so that they're all on a similar path throughout the journey.
I think that's great advice, that sort of pick and mix. And as you say, really important you get the level right, and that there are, everybody has the same basic understanding, but then you can accelerate away at different levels. And I think that brings me on to the third point. We know lots of people very motivated at the moment, doing lots of self-learning, investing in themselves, maybe not being supported by their companies. And I think what's really interesting there is, what are they choosing to do? Some of it is not work related at all, but it's about, the mental health, meditation or fitness. And I heard something really interesting. I was chatting to James Morgan, a data consultant in the industry with massive experience in large enterprises. I first worked with him when he was at Telefonica and then at British Gas. And he was saying he'd been looking at the way that habits change, and apparently it takes 90 days for somebody's habits to change.
Wow, interesting.
Really
90
interesting.
days. Yeah,
90 days. So actually, if you want to reinforce your training to change the way people work, or change some of their skills, I think too often training is delivered once, and you might have some check-ins, but there's not enough repetition. So I think, that's something we might take from self-learning back into, if you like, our work world, and go, well, actually, we all know if we want to take up a new sport, or we have to keep going at it. But I don't see that so much in work skills.
Well, I think that's where there is an advantage for digital training and learning, because you're right. If you've got the risk that somebody attends, whether it's an internal or external training course, and they just are there for the free lunch, and they sit and they go through the day and they go through the motions, you need to make that learning actionable. And therefore, often how we would have done it, of course, would be to have that follow-up, as you say. Now, that follow-up's difficult because of the geography. You can't get everyone back in the same room so easily. But of course, a virtual room, you can. So I think what we may see is that you'll have, again, that first starting point, and then maybe rather than, as we talked about, those 3, 4, 90-minute chunks, maybe you do the first 90 minutes, and then it's weeks later that people check back in to say, well, how much have you done? What have you learned from this? What can you show and tell? That then you pick up a next stage. So I think even the timings in terms of the delivery may be very different, and it gives us a chance to really review it, which is excellent.
I think that's great, and you've just reminded me of something, because clearly we're not getting the free lunch anymore. But I once did a speaking gig out in Sri Lanka, which was fabulous. But I was warned by my lovely client Ian Ramsden, and it was on digital marketing. He said, Shane, whatever you do, don't be put off by the fact that when you start your session, there'll probably be about 10% of the audience in the room. And I said, what do you mean only 10%? He said, oh, the room will be full at about 10 minutes before the tea break when we serve the free food buffet. And sure enough, that's when everybody rocked up. So great learning. That was very amusing.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so I have to say I tend to teach in Finland, and I do really admire the Finnish breakfasts and their incredibly strong coffee. So I am missing that. My ability to hear conversations 6 miles off, having had a few brews over there, is disappearing. So yeah, it's not all about online forever. But it's not about just doing it for the sake of it as well. And that probably leads us to your 4th point.
It does. Yeah, how are you going to measure it? I think, we wouldn't be data-led marketers unless we had measurement on the takeouts, really. And, what are going to be your key performance indicators? And I love the fact that Debbie's title is learning. It is all about how do you ensure that learning is embedded? How are you going to measure that? How are you going to measure some of the softer measures? And I think that's really important to think about. It's not just a tick, they did this training, they logged on, they did it. But your point you made right at the beginning, Steve, is what I think as a trainer really makes it rewarding to both you and I is when you get that contact from a delegate months later and they say, I did that thing you mentioned and it worked. And oh wow, that's your moment that you basically live for.
Shane, that's the moment when you wish you'd have put a 10% uplift into their contract to say, look, let's get some recompense. No, you're absolutely right. That's the reason you should be doing it for, is it's practical and it's actionable, and you see things in progress and move forward. I think you make a really interesting point as well. In fact, it leads on to a discussion I had with Matt at Circus Street, who I think we should hear from, around it's the format that you use as well. And Circus Street, as we know, they create interactive and very entertaining marketing and sales training. And that's part of it as well, is to consider the format of the delivery. That you can't just transfer PowerPoint slides into a digital environment and expect them to always work. You need to think about that slightly lean back. Is it more like a TV production? That sort of thing. And in fact, that's where I started. So Matt Darmon is business director at Circus Street, and I had a chat with him earlier in the week and said, look, first and foremost, if somebody's listening in and wants to get started with online learning, what does he recommend?
Yeah, so there's generally 2 types of organisations that we talk to. I guess the first is that organisation that absolutely knows where they need to get to. So they have a burning business or learning objective they need to satisfy and achieve. There's a North Star they're aiming towards. Or the second type is an organisation that knows they need to be spending more time on this, but as you say, don't really know where to start. And it isn't easy because it can be quite bewildering. There are a number of learning providers out there. And there's a number of courses that people can sign up to. So I think
if you've got those businesses, Matt, that, as you've mentioned when we were chatting earlier, that they perhaps are not new to face to face. They're used to and comfortable with the idea of staff training is often put them in a room physically together. Of course, that's just not on the table right now. So how does one transition? Is it about teaching the same kind of courses? Do you need to assess where they are as individual learners before you then start to go and scope out the programs that you put in front of them?
Yeah, you can do. Yeah, you can do. I mean, for instance, we have a number of tools at Circus Street that would help an organisation and an individual learner benchmark where they and their company are at, prior to completing a lesson. So all of our lessons are bookended with pre and post questionnaires. So the pre-questionnaire allows the learner to benchmark their knowledge going into a topic, and the post questionnaire allows them to see that knowledge and that capability uplift. And that's one basic metric that we can use to demonstrate a shift in knowledge, which is certainly helpful, from a reporting point of view. But typically when we start on a program with a client, we'll aim to understand again what those business objectives are. And once we know what those business objectives are and where they want to get to, we can recommend the correct program of lessons for a learning group to complete. And then through these sort of hard metrics, through knowledge uplift, we can also track behaviour change in learners. And typically this will be through holding informal interviews and completing feedback surveys, because tracking behaviour change is really important to then demonstrating business impact, which of course is the key thing. And I think that's often something that training, whether it's face-to-face or online learning, can neglect, and that's really the key thing. It's demonstrating effectiveness, and often that can be missed. And so something that we find really effective is capturing what those objectives are, so you can measure that those shifts in behaviour and what that actual business impact is. So when you're having to report to your senior leadership team how well this training program is going, Circus Street are able to do that and help you demonstrate that effectiveness. But again, we can work with you to identify what those learning objectives are, and what those lessons need to be. So if you're starting out on a learning program around digital, we need to understand what that basic literacy is, and so we can help raise the floor of understanding. So it might be to teach some basic lessons around how ad tech works, or how the media marketplace works, and then we can start to look at implementing or covering learning around digital strategy, and start to implement learning around different channels, how you reach your audience, and we take it from there. At the moment, the big topics we're seeing demand is across search. We're seeing huge demand across e-commerce, but also around customer experience and user experience. They're the big sort of topics that we're seeing at the moment, and often are a good starting point.
Yeah, interesting around that. And as you said, Matt, a really good point around learning. And I know this from a tutoring point of view. It doesn't matter what the environment is. Training is not just training for training's sake. It needs to be actionable, as you say, from a payback point of view for the business, but also for that individual to get the confidence that, okay, I now understand this better. As you said, search and how people are using Google and other search engines far more at the moment because of the lockdown environment, making sure that the individuals know how to exploit that from their own marketing means, but the business are also seeing that Steve's been on a course, he's actually doing something now that is delivering business value on the back of that training. That's the really critical bit.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think, and this is the thing, isn't it? E-learning has had a bad rep over a number of years for being quite dry. You think of e-learning, and a lot of people will think of mandatory compliance training, where it's tick box to show you've understood how to correctly, lift a box, or you know where the fire exit is. It drums at these really dull perceptions. But I think e-learning has to be much more creative and engaging than that, and that's certainly something that we've tried to create with Circus Street. And so when people come through this online learning, there's been elements of gamification or interaction built in, so people can start to apply what they've learned. But I think having that face-to-face element is important to embed what you've learned. And of course, that's not always impossible at the moment. So I think companies need to think about how we can still retain that interactivity between learners. So for instance, what we've done is create these workshop packs that can be delivered remotely, and that allows learners to take all that theory, take the case studies that they might have seen online, and then apply it to their business. I think that's really, really important. It's that embedding the learning, because that is ultimately what's going to drive that business impact.
It also strikes me as well, back to a point you made earlier when we were chatting offline around how trends are changing, that people consume training at different times. You're seeing spikes over weekend and in the week. Of course, our general working days have changed a lot. We've not got the commute. We're all working from home if we're working. So the other benefit, I suppose, rather than an organization being new to digital online training and fearful of what it loses, is also what it gains, is that actually that learner can go and learn, can sign on to that module and that best practice when suits them, as we're all trying to adapt to our work-life balance. If that's best for them to do on a Sunday afternoon or a late Tuesday evening, they've got that option that, of course, you just wouldn't have if you were running things in the rigid face-to-face environment.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it fits in around their schedule, and a lot of companies are taking very serious, you know, the notion of you know, of well-being and certainly of mental health, and allowing their employees to manage their working day to fit in around their families and other challenges they have as they adapt to working from home. And we've always recommended, you know, long before the COVID-19 pandemic, we've always recommended that learners, you know, find time to plan learning into their calendar. But as you say, something that we're getting, a piece of feedback we're getting regularly from learners at the moment, is they're finding that a good time to schedule for learning is the time they would otherwise be spending on commuting. So people are often logging into the platform for that half hours, you know, in the morning, or the half hours as they'd be, you know, traveling home. So they're finding that really, really useful. But again, as you say, we're also finding people logging on a lot more online, which I find really interesting. Perhaps they need to find a bit of time to get away from their families a little bit. Who knows? But something else we're finding as well is learners are saying that they're finding it really helpful to buddy up with a colleague. So they're not necessarily needing to do this alone. You know, given the access to things like Microsoft Teams or Zoom or what have you, not only can you do your online learning, but if you're buddied up with a colleague through a VC of some sort, you can also share in real time some ideas and tips. Okay, that was an interesting point that the speaker made there. How would we apply this to our company? We're finding that you know, just because you're at home doing online learning, it doesn't mean that you need to be alone doing it. You can still catch up with your colleagues whilst you're doing that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point around that collaboration, isn't it? Again, as we've seen, the Zoom generation, as we're now becoming known as, have this ability to collaborate for basic things like meetings. So, of course, it naturally extends into training and learning. And I suppose, Matt, it feels a lot like in another walk of life, if you're trying to go and get out there and be fit and exercise physically, rather than, as we're talking about, exercising one's brain with training, it's much easier to do exercise if you've got a gym buddy or a running partner. So you're just recreating something that we already know works well for humans, but against the axis of training and learning.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think people need to be entertained. People know that they need to invest in their own development, and having their employer support that gives them the freedom to invest in their own learning development. And of course, the way we've approached it, the way we've approached our own portfolio of content, is to make it feel entertaining. So it's quite high production value. And I think that really, really resonates with learners.
Some really interesting points there, Shane. And as Matt said, that production values, that entertaining, and Circus Street are excellent at that. That is certainly something to consider as part of our arsenal. But it isn't all about that. I think we can learn some lessons that if you've not got great content, and you know that from an offline environment when you've done face-to-face, it certainly isn't going to work in digital. There's lots of good resources though, Shane, if people are still interested in getting started. Where does one go? What do you think?
I think that's a great point, and I think there's some that's more along the lines of edutainment, if you want to call it that.
Nice. Yep. We shall.
You know, good. That's, you know, the YouTube, you know, there's loads on there. Fantastic. It's free. It's not always easy to find it. So again, I really hope that people who are listening to this podcast will give shout outs to their favorite marketing resources on LinkedIn and on YouTube. My personal, I think they absolutely nailed it. I loved the Earnest videos. They did a whole series on statistics for B2B marketers.
Yeah, absolutely. Vital statistics for B2B, I think.
Yeah, and I got amazing level of views because it was interesting entertaining, and you learnt loads. So that to me is good practice. Where else do I go? Well, obviously LinkedIn bought Linda. There's loads of free resources. I think the last time I searched on there for marketers, there's over 100 LinkedIn tutorials. Some are free, some are paid. What about you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great. I mean, sometimes it can be a bit LinkedIn centric in the way that Google has great content, but it's obviously talking about Google. HubSpot's a resource that it's an interesting one. And funny enough, actually back to Ernest and Chris at Ernest, I remember having the conversation with him a number of years ago when HubSpot first surfaced. We didn't actually realize HubSpot sold marketing automation software. It was more they looked like they were a publisher of digital marketing best practice. And that's their content marketing approach, is to create an awful lot of free, very good, valuable resource that helps you learn, not just how to use HubSpot, but a much broader array as well.
So I think as a top tip, one of the things that we should all do, including myself, I put myself firmly in this camp, is take a hard look at the tools that we use every day. And whether that's, something boring like Outlook, or whether it's LinkedIn or Excel or Zoom or Twitter or Salesforce or HubSpot, all of these vendors have amazing training resources, absolutely fantastic. As you say, some of them win awards, whether it's HubSpot or Marketo or Salesforce. Some of the vendors are opening up their training, which would be part of a paid package for free, so you can self-certify. So I think there is an onus on ourselves to invest in our own skills. I've had to do it. I mean, I mentioned right at the beginning, I've been training for a long time. A lot of these tools were not around there, and I wouldn't have learnt it without help from others, including creating this podcast with you, Steve. And I'm glad you're doing the technical stuff, by the way.
Attempting the technical stuff. Yeah, I think it's a very good point, Shane. It's easy, actually. You miss the fact that Microsoft through Outlook, etc., and all of the different providers, we often go to it from a support point of view, a reactionary, need some help with something I can't make work, rather than that more lean back, what can I go and learn to do differently today? I think it's a balance point though, Shane, isn't it? That's the other thing to remember, as we've said, is just because in theory people have got the time because maybe the commute's gone. I think what we're learning as we settle into this is that it's a 7-day week. That Monday to Friday working pattern in the weekend has eroded for sure. So you just make sure that from an employer responsibility point of view, that we're not forcing people to have to go and learn because they've got the time. That's not great management anyway, but it's just not going to go in. So trying to find that balance, I guess.
And that's where I think different formats come in, picking up again on that point. I think there's quite a nice, I think I should perhaps copyright this one, fit to learn. What was fascinating about the feedback from people who have given us the feedback about listening to our podcast is that they're doing something else at the same time. They're walking or they're on their rowing machine. I think that was Richard Robinson. Ruth was cycling on her stationary
we've had people on bikes. We've had people all sorts of, or they say they're on forms of exercise anyway, Shane. But yeah, you're right. Absolutely. Fit that multitasking. And I did read a stat, actually, although initially podcasts overall had really plummeted in the first few weeks of lockdown because of the commute going, is that B2B podcasts particularly, there's been a real growth in that area because it's another very convenient way of trying to educate and to learn. It fits in with that mix, as you say.
And it's a break from screen time, going back to what we point, from your Zoom fatigue. So I think you need to think about that as well. Other great resources, some of these are paid, some of them are opening up to allow more access in the current climate, include Smart Insights. I know, you and I are both great fans of Dave Chaffee's toolkits, amazing resource. Then you've got all of the resources on B2B marketing sites. And then lastly, and certainly not least, because, we both have done or do a lot for DMA. And I think that initiative they've just launched, and whether you want to talk a little bit about that, is really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So the DMA and the IDM have, I don't know the exact ins and outs, but have put together hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of joint funding with the DM Trust for people that are furloughed, marketing professionals that are furloughed or have been made redundant of the last few months, to go and get free training. And of course, as we've talked about, the training can be done online, and qualification as well, Shane. I think it's important to say. So yes, you can go and learn, but perhaps for some people in that situation, it's a great chance for them to go and get a qualification that might really help them stand out when things do begin to pick up, or indeed in the interim.
Absolutely. So this sort of giving back by the industry, if you know anybody, you're listening to this, who has been furloughed or who's been made redundant in marketing, or I think I'm very passionate about this. If you've just graduated and you're hoping for a career in marketing and you're just thinking, in this weird world, where do I even start? Start with this, because this is what the money is aimed at. It's growing future talent that will support our industry and get us through this. So we'll include the link to this amazing initiative at the end in the LinkedIn post as well.
Yeah, fabulous. I think that gives people plenty to think about. Thank you, Shane, and thank you, everyone. So do find out on LinkedIn. We'll share some of those resources, but equally, you can keep in touch via www.whatwe'velearnedpodcast.co.uk. Thanks, everyone.